I'm just waiting for the live stream to click in. Fantastic. Good morning, everyone. I'm Susan Murray, Director of the David Hume Institute, and I am delighted to welcome you all here this morning to this quarter's Insights from the Understanding Scotland Economy Tracker. For those of you joining us in person, thank you to the Phoenix Group for the wonderful breakfast and the networking we've had at Standard Life House this morning. For those of you joining us online, oh, hang on, I'm meant to be holding the microphone, aren't I? Behind the laptop. Do you need me to start again, Alan? Okay. Sorry, that was a practice. Good morning. I'm Susan Murray, Director of the David Hume Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you here this morning to the launch of this quarter's Insights from the Understanding Scotland Economy Tracker. For those of you joining us in person, thank you to the Phoenix Group for the wonderful breakfast and the networking we've had at Standard Life House. And for those of you joining us online, we hope you have the chance to enjoy some breakfast. Before the discussion gets underway, and just to keep you all safe, I'd like to confirm there are no fire alarms this morning. So if the fire alarm does go off, please head to the nearest exit. We are live streaming this event, and that's why the speakers have microphones. They do not work for amplification in the room. So if anyone is hard of hearing, please feel free to move nearer the front and we'll make sure there's room for you. Now, I'd like to introduce the speakers for today. Scott Edgar is the Senior Research Manager at the Diffley Partnership, and he'll present the latest results from the Understanding Scotland Economy Tracker. The findings track the economic confidence and buying intentions over time, as well as helping us to understand and monitor economic attitudes and public opinion. Scott will be followed by Gary Gillespie, who's the Chief Economist at the Scottish Government. Gary has been at the Scottish Government's Chief Economic Advisor since 2011, and he provides economic advice to the First Minister and the ministers across a range of strategic economic issues. He publishes regular assessments of the state of the economy and analysis of the key impacts of things like EU exit, COVID, supply chain disruption and inflation, and changes in the Scottish and UK economies. Gary will be followed by Kathryn Welch, who is the Interim Director of Culture Counts. Kathryn leads a network of arts and heritage and creative industries organisations and works to promote and protect and demystify the cultural sector in Scotland. She sits on the Scottish Government's Culture and Fair Work Task Force and is regularly invited to present in Parliament and with funders and the media. Prior to Kathryn's role Prior to Kathryn's current role, she led a Creative Lives programme and also the Robert Arts Centre in Stirling. So we're set for a really interesting discussion. The data has got lots of insights, but also differences and nuance, and there might even be a glimmer of hope. With that, I'm going to hand over to Scott.
Good morning, everybody. So, as Susan mentioned, that these are the latest findings from the Understanding Scotland Economy Tracker for February 2025. So this survey goes into the field in the quarters as it runs, basically on the 1st of the month. And by the end of the month, we have these really interesting insights that we're able to give you 4 times a year about people's perceptions around the economy, what their priorities are in terms of policy, and also their buying intentions as well. So, what is Understanding Scotland? It's a quarterly survey tool measuring the most important aspects of our lives. As I mentioned here, the fieldwork ran from the 4th to the 10th of February this time because the 1st was a Saturday. So you usually go for the 1st, but that's the reason it wasn't the 1st. And it received 2,194 responses. So every quarter we're getting around 2,000 responses to this survey. So the first finding that we always kind of lead on here, and I should say we've done this 14 times now, so since 2021 we've now been doing it, so it's been a long time running. One of the questions that we ask right at the start is, what do you think the kind of general direction of travel is in Scotland? And we ask people a very basic question, which is effectively, do you think things in Scotland are going in the right direction, the wrong direction? And a lot of people say don't know. And the reason we do that is it's a kind of broad idea of a perception of how things are going, right? Now, it doesn't have a kind of nuance under it, but it's an idea of how do you think things are moving in Scotland. And what we see here is, for the first time in a long time, a kind of, significant decrease in the proportion of people that think that things in Scotland are going in the wrong direction. Now, it's still more than half. We still have 53% of people saying that they believe things in Scotland are going in the wrong direction, but that's the lowest figure for a year. And we also have the highest figure for 2 years in terms of people saying that they think things are going in the right direction. Granted, it's about a quarter at 24%, but it's still a 4 percentage point increase on the last survey that we did. Now, if any of you took in sort of Anas Sarwar's conference speech on Friday at the Scottish Labour Conference, you'll hear that he mentioned quite a lot, and I didn't count it exactly, but how many times he said people in Scotland feel things are going on the wrong track, people in Scotland feel things are going on the wrong track, and then a kind of series of examples of why that might be. And this is clearly going to be a kind of narrative going into the election from the Scottish Labour Party in 2026, where they're going to talk a lot about this idea that people in Scotland think that things are not moving in the right way. In terms of kind of differences amongst people, we tend to find that people who are older and of sort of a C2DE social grade are more likely to think things in Scotland are going in the wrong direction, whereas younger people in Scotland, aged 16 to 34, are a bit more likely to think things are going in the right direction, which is quite interesting. But again, nowhere near like a majority or anything. The general sense is that things are kind of going in the wrong direction. But this is the glimmer of hope that Susan was alluding to, in the sense that we see some kind of turn in an idea of positivity. Granted, that quarter, but it's still better than lower than that, And another thing that we've been tracking right across the series is people's policy priorities. And these have remained fairly stable over time. Healthcare and the NHS remains by far and away the kind of top priority that people in Scotland talk about. So the question asks people, what do you think are the top 3 issues facing Scotland today? And 50% of respondents say healthcare and the NHS is one of the top 3 issues facing Scotland today. And that's up 4 percentage points from the last wave. Now, we do occasionally see kind of seasonal fluctuation in that. So when healthcare and the NHS is in the news a lot, especially during sort of, when there's been crises in winter or there's been backlogs on waiting lists and things like that, it tends to be a bit higher. But 50% of people are picking it in their top 3 issues. There's been a kind of continuous decline now for quite a few waves now of the proportion that say cost of living and inflation is amongst our top 3 concerns, but it does remain at a third. So it's still kind of by far and away the second biggest issue that people in Scotland identify, and has been for quite some time now. But there's this cluster of issues sort of that have all been together for quite a long time now, where they're kind of ranging in the sort of 15 to 20% range. In this wave, we've actually seen the economy have a 4 percentage point increase in terms of an issue amongst people in Scotland, which is one of the bigger changes we've actually observed in that sort of group of issues. And that group of issues includes things like education and schools, immigration, trust in politics, house and social care, crime and criminal justice. So what we see here is the economy. I've kind of been saying for a few waves now when I've stood here, what's going to happen in that cluster? Like, is something going to emerge as the issue that comes out of those that could be kind of defining as we look ahead to the next couple of years? The economy's had a surge now. We can maybe speculate some of the reasons why that might be. But again, if you were listening to kind of Anas Sarwar's speech at the conference, you heard a lot of talk around, healthcare and the NHS. He was talking about changing, the health boards and the structure of the NHS, ending the 8 a.m. Rush for appointments. And also, I kind of a lot of talk about economy and making Scotland sort of work for people. So clearly there's signals coming through that people think these are going to be the issues that carry forward. Equally, they do differ depending on age. So housing, for example, a more salient issue amongst younger Scots. And there hasn't been much change in immigration. So kind of despite a lot of the talk that we've been seeing around, the rise of reform and things, it's still not really breaking through as a top issue in Scotland. And it still remains, if you were to put the issues in order at a sort of UK level and a Scotland level, immigration remains lower amongst Scots in general than it does kind of if you put it across the UK as a top issue. So that's always kind of worth having that in mind. Yep.
Sorry, can I ask? I seem to remember last year climate change was on this and it seems to have dropped off.
Yeah.
Anything like that?
It's just because it's got lower amongst people. So basically, because of so many issues, we just cut this off at around 10%, but it's dipped again. But it's been it sort of fluctuates between, so like right at the start when we did it, it was around 18%. That was the same month as COP20 in Glasgow. So I think we've always kind of thought that was higher around then for that reason. However, when it kind of comes back on, it tends to come back on in summer months where we see events like, kind of maybe like when there was a wildfires in Europe last year and things like that. So it's just because it's kind of dropped off a bit. And actually, it's a really good segue onto my next slide, where we kind of look at differences by, age and gender. So we can see here the kind of top 5 issues, if you want. So healthcare and the NHS, cost of living, inflation, the economy, poverty, inequality, education, schools. Now, across each of these, where we've done these divides between 16 to 34, 65 plus in male and female, healthcare and the NHS and cost of living inflation are the top two issues across each of those groups. You're quite right to point out about climate change, because actually last quarter, climate change was in the top 5 issues amongst those aged 16 to 34, and this time it's not. So this time, kind of education in schools has gone higher there amongst that cohort. But in terms of other kind of interesting differences, you can see that, you know, those aged 65 plus are more interested in social care, see social care and immigration as one of the top 3 issues. And actually amongst men, immigration is the kind of 4th most salient issue when looking across the piece. So we do see some interesting differences here between different groups. And, you know, there's also way more demographics in this in the report, but it's just illustrative of some of both the similarities in terms of keeping healthcare and the NHS at the top across the groups, but there are little different policy differences there. So as we look at, you know, going into May 2026, who are people going to be pitching for? Yes.
Just a question, always come to workforce in the 80s. I'm surprised job security or prospects is not there. Is that covered in one of the other categories, cost of living or economy?
Yeah, basically kind of covered in there. And I've got a slide in a second about sort of, you know, people's satisfaction with their job security and things like that as well. But again, we've got here kind of like economic priorities here. We have we've got a kind of list of economic priorities. So at the top there we have 6 and 10, saying that they have top priority in terms of the economy is cost of living and inflation, followed by lack of spending in public services, and then followed by living standards and wages at 30% amongst their top 3 issues. This has been really, really, really stable this wave, so there's not been loads of movement between the kind of economic issues that we've been measuring. One that has had, so the biggest increase was actually the green economy and addressing the financial impacts of climate change, which is quite interesting. And I've been kind of racking my brain to think about why that might be. But it'll be interesting to see if it kind of continues going forward, that grows as an issue. There has been a lot of discussion around it, and maybe we're picking up that. I'm not sure, but it'll be interesting to see how that progresses over the coming weeks and months. And this is a bit where I sound like a kind of doomsayer every single quarter, but we ask people about their economic, you know, outlook. So we ask people, you know, what do you think's happened to general economic conditions over the last 12 months, and what do you think's going to happen in the next 12 months? And what we find is that 6 in 10 Scots report that they think things have got worse in the last 12 months, and 2/3 think that they're going to get worse again in 12 months' time. Now, what's interesting about that, which I'll show in a second, is that actually in the August wave last year, August 2024, we actually seen a little bit of an improvement in this. But since Keir Starmer got into the Rose Garden and said things are going to get worse before they get better, it feels like people really heard that and they kind of reverted back to this pessimism. So I feel like he kind of burst his own bubble kind of almost immediately after getting elected. Kind of people were like, okay, things are going to get worse before they get better. But what is always interesting is that people's perceptions of what's going to happen at a general economic level is always worse than what they think is going to happen to their own finances. So we find, you know, that while it's, you know, 44% think that their personal finances are worse than a year ago, that's kind of similar to the proportion that think it's about the same, and 14% think they've improved. It's worth noting that, this year has literally 0 figures in it. It's much better when you're looking at, you know, the general economic outlook, and you can see here that less than 1 in 10 think generally things have got better or are going to get better. But then we can see people are slightly more optimistic when they look at their own financial circumstances. And interestingly, again, younger people are actually, those between age 16 to 34, are the most likely to think that their personal financial circumstances are going to improve in the next year, albeit not at a kind of massive rate, but they're more likely to be optimistic about what's going to happen to their own personal finances. And what this chart here shows is basically that kind of those betters taken away from being perceptions it's going to be worse or has been worse. Now, every time I show this, I have to remind everybody that the axis on the left, starting at 0% at the top, this is all negative here. So this is all basically, we've always measured a net negative perception on these things. And again, I say this every time, but I'll say it again anyway. If you look at sort of February 23, that's the floor, right? We're talking about, this is like, you know, minus 90% net, like, you know, net of people saying that they think things are, you know, worse than the last year. But what this illustrates is the difference between personal circumstances and, you know, general. And you can see that gap that I talked about, the top 2 lines being perceptions around people's personal finances, and the bottom two being general. We can see it's generally negative. It's not as negative as it was before, but it's still, you know, we've still got people are generally pessimistic about what things are going to look like in the future. Again, nowhere near that sort of floor as we were coming out of the pandemic, but you can see that kind of dip. You know, we've seen it was on an upward trajectory until about August last year, and then it sort of dipped again now. With the personals, it got slightly better this wave, and it'll be interesting to see whether that continues going forward in the future waves, but generally kind of negative sentiment when it comes to economic outlook. And that has impacts on people, right? You know, that kind of, you know, you think that your financial circumstances have got worse, you look ahead and you think that they're going to get worse. You make decisions about, you know, your spending and things that you're going to have to do as a result of that. And what this question here shows is how concerns with money matters have affected people in the last 12 months. So the biggest thing that we see reported here is around, you know, cutting back on leisure activities. More than half of people report that they've cut back on leisure activities as a result of concerns with money matters. Also reducing non-essential spending. We've seen a 5 percentage point drop between waves and reduced heating or energy use, but we do see seasonality in that, you know, overall. So that it'll be interesting to see again what kind of happens with that. And then people basically reporting that they save less than usual. But we have a kind of series of measures on here that are about mental health and losing sleep and, you know, feeling less effective at work. That we like to look at these because we think about what impact that might have on productivity and, you know, people's sort of experience in the workforce. And what I actually see here is that 29% of people report that they've lost sleep or had an impact on their mental health as a result of concerns with money matters in the last 12 months. And that's a lot of people, right, when you kind of when you think about that. But it's not felt evenly, and 16% say no impact. So 16% of people feel are not concerned with their money matters and actually feel kind of all right, are not making these decisions. But we see differences between different cohorts again in this. So if you look again, this is a comparison on the furthest left between those aged 16 to 34 and 65 plus. And basically younger people are more likely to be reporting impacts on their mental health and feeling less effective at work, saving less than usual than sort of their counterparts in the 65 plus age bracket. And interestingly, on the right, we look at households with children. And what we see here is, you know, that households with children are more likely to be cutting back on leisure activities, which has impacts on children's ability maybe to participate in different hobbies, abilities to have experiences, abilities to do certain things that, you know, households with children are not having to make those decisions. But also strained relationships at home we see is much higher, reported to be much higher amongst households with children than households without as a result of concerns over money matters. And we've only kind of run that aspect twice, and that's twice we've found that. So it does feel like that is something that's kind of carrying through, and it's having an impact on people's home lives as well, the concern with money matters. And we also ask people like how satisfied they are with their, you know, different aspects of their income. So at an overall level, we see around just over a third of people say they're satisfied with their income, and around 4 in 10 dissatisfied with their income. But we also ask that in relation to covering the cost of living and ability to meet household bills. And it's a kind of similar picture. We see around, you know, 3 in 10 say they're feeling that they're satisfied that their income covers the cost of living, and around 4 in 10 content that they're able to meet their household bills. This way we asked about job security for the first time in this battery of questions, and around 6 in 10 say that they're satisfied with their job security. And one thing that will be interesting to kind of look at going forward is what decisions are people making who are not satisfied with their job security versus those who are. And then similarly, you know, in terms of those, and always we disinclude people who say that these aren't applicable to them, by the way, 7 in 10 saying that their employment provides them with enough paid hours. And in my final slide, because I think I'm a wee bit over time actually, is on you know, basically buying intentions. So what we look at is we ask people, are you going to spend more money or less money, or about the same on a battery of different things. Now this graph here only shows the proportion who say they're going to spend less money on the things. So what we see is, you know, we split out eating out this time as well. So those two kind of rogue dots, it's because we split eating out into between takeaways and restaurants, because basically what we hear is that there's different patterns in behaviour in terms of that going to eat out versus sort of getting a delivery order to your house. Some people are supplementing or replacing their eating out behaviour with that, so we wanted to have that there. And we can see that they're the highest people say that they're going to spend less on. Actually, there's been a drop in people who say they're going to spend less on leisure and culture, which is quite interesting, I think, for this wave. It was really, really high when we asked about it about two years ago. People saying they were going to spend less money on that, but that has dropped. On the flip side, those 6 in 10 say they expect to spend more on their utility bills in the next 12 months, and 45% say that they expect to spend more on their housing costs, which gives a kind of picture again around that people are expecting to spend money on these essential spends rather than on discretionary spends, and that might be impacting some of the behaviour that we see in the earlier charts. Thank you very much for your attention. I have ran slightly over, but any questions or anything like that, I'm sure we'll be able to take them after we've had the discussion. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. My name's Gary Gillespie. I've been asked to give a kind of bigger picture overview in response to the survey. So it's worth saying at the outset, obviously in 2024 we emerged from a kind of 2.5-year inflation shock, and I think that's reflected in some of the data there. Headline inflation peaked in October 2022 at 11%, and actually that correlates very strongly with the kind of sentiment falling at that time. During that period we've essentially had flat growth for the last 2 years, so we've seen kind of growth 2022, 2023 being negative in that sense. And the other bits of context worth remembering is in response to the inflation shock, we've seen interest rates starting to rise, hitting people's kind of mortgages alongside energy costs. And the key thing for household finances is we had a period where real wages were squeezed, so inflation was much higher than the pay growth. So we've seen that kind of period with negative real wage growth in Scotland through most of 2022 and into 2023. So that's the context, I think, over the last 2 years. And actually 2024 kind of, we've seen a reversal in some of that. So what we see in 2024 was real wage growth returning. We've seen inflation coming back down, pay being higher. We've seen inflation falling. Inflation hit its 2% target briefly in September 2024. We've seen actually business confidence and consumer sentiment returning. The first half of 2024, we've seen confidence coming back. We've seen growth in the economy, and as it's just been depicted there, we've seen that growth starting to kind of confidence starting to tail off. The UK economy grew by 0.9% in 2024. So relatively kind of positive. But I suppose that takes me to the survey today. So what are we seeing today? So basically, confidence and sentiment started to shift during 2024 again. As described about kind of halfway through the year, people started the year fairly optimistic, seeing things improving, inflation was coming down, you had real wage growth, you had the UK election, more certainty, and then that started to kind of waver over the summer. And actually it's been a kind of tale of two halves. First half of 2024 was quite strong confidence, things, and it started to peter out with kind of lower growth towards the end of the last period. So these surveys are really, really important because confidence has two main effects. If you think of consumers, it links into their consumption, so that daily kind of what you're going to do, what you're going to buy. And for business also, it links into their investment employment decisions. So businesses are thinking about what's the environment for investing? Is this a good environment? So consumer sentiment fell back in 2024. Our own tracker suggests a low in November. So November was a low point, a small negative. It came back up, and we tracked positive sentiment during 2024. So actually it came back above that negative threshold. Business sentiment declined through 2024. Linked to two issues really. Linked to the UK budget in part, the kind of the whole national insurance contributions rise, kind of cost of labour, concerns about that, and also linked to kind of a worry about falling demand. So basically, what we've seen in the economy, we've seen kind of less consumption. So what I would say is the outlook, a bit like the survey, is really finely balanced in terms of growth this year. On the positives, real wage growth remains strong. The most recent data published to December, we're still seeing nominal real wage growth 5% in the economy. So people's earnings are improving. So that's a positive. Unemployment remains really low, below 4%. If anything, there's still over a fifth of businesses struggling to get people to work. So again, that's a positive. However, a big however is uncertainty, and there's more global uncertainty now. We see the kind of US economic policy impacting trade and confidence, and I think that manifests itself in if you look at the Bank of England January inflation report, they cut interest rates, so that's a positive for households to 4.5%, but also in forecasting inflation to rise to 3.7%. So that's unusual for the bank. Why are they doing that? Because they're uncertain about the outlook. They're concerned on the demand side that actually the global uncertainty is going to impact demand, trade, and we're going to have a natural slowdown in the economy. So if that happens, there's no need to cut interest. There's no need to tighten interest rates. If anything, you cut interest rates. But they've also got a concern on the supply side that actually there's supply constraints. Some areas of the economy can't get people, and there's still wage pressure. So they don't really know, and they've hedged on the side of uncertainty and what's happening in terms of global events. So that's interesting in that regard. Let me just finish up with kind of some final thoughts for 2025. So there's some different drivers of growth in Scotland within the UK. We're very similar to the UK economy, but there's some differences, and I think the differences I would highlight are exposure to investment and trade. So in investment, really positive exposure around all the green energy, offshore wind. If you look at the pipeline of activity that's planned there, the jobs, the infrastructure, even the upgrade in the grid structure is billions of pounds of spend. So all of that is kind of counter-cyclical, it's long-term, it's not related directly to the kind of macro environment. So that's really positive for Scotland, and we'll see that coming through. On the trade side, we export a lot of food and drink to the US and others, so tariff disruption in trade could be negative. But so, I mean, overall, I'm more on the positive side. I think sentiment's important, but so is real wage growth. Unemployment remains kind of low by historical standards. Inflation is sticky. Inflation is sticky at the moment, but it will come down. And sentiment can change quickly. We've had a kind of negative expectation sentiment shock, I think, towards the end of the year. I think the UK budget in March will be important. If nothing else, to get beyond the whole negativity around Nick's employers' tax, to just move beyond that, because I think that's been quite a long period. And just to say, I think I see a similar picture for growth for the economy in 2025 than 2024, about 1%, probably starting weaker and strengthening as the year goes on. But all of that you have to hedge with what's happening globally. I mean, a lot of things have happened over the last week, could be quite significant for the kind of global economy and outlook, but really, really important surveys. And I think, as was said in the presentation, tracking things over time is really, really important, because that's where you get the real value of it. But thanks anyway, that's enough for me, and I'll turn to you.
Morning folks, I'm Kathryn Welch, and I've been invited to reflect on how some of these trends impact and are reflected in the culture sector, by which I mean arts, heritage, creative industries. Particularly, I think, in light of that finding that people are worried about their leisure activity spend and they're looking to cut back in some of those areas. So the culture sector has been experiencing a longer term shift in attendance and in demographics, one that is absolutely reflected, I think, in concerns about the cost of living, still in many ways bouncing back from the effects of COVID. But it's not, I don't think, a simple story of people going out less. It feels much more, as was reflected in the data, about a shifting picture of who does what. And that's really interesting in terms of challenges and opportunities for the sector. So demographically, I think what we're seeing almost across the sector is a shift in the core regular attendance at places like art galleries, theatres, music venues. So many of those organisations have relied for a long time on a very regular attendance, very loyal attendance of older, retired, middle-class audiences, people who are very experienced in cultural attendance, very knowledgeable often. And they made up the bread and butter of lots of organisations' kind of patronage. The behaviours of that group were fundamentally shifted by COVID. Many never returned to their pre-COVID habits of regular attendance. And there's kind of an easy story of younger people go out less, younger people don't socialise in the same way. Some of that's true. The impact of the cost of living and related but not quite the same fears of cost of living, I think, absolutely reduces attendance overall, and also I think increases inequality in arts attendance, shifts who goes and who feels like they can go. But there's a few deeper and different things at play that I just wanted to seed for our conversation. It's not quite true that young people don't do culture in the same way that older people did. The habits have changed, things are different. And there's three things that I pulled out to mention. The first is that a transformational move to online experiences, digital engagement, streaming, absolutely changes how people expect to experience their leisure time, how they expect to receive and participate in culture. It's brought new categories of cultural participation into the mainstream, things like gaming, things connected to fashion. And although whilst people's financial uncertainty might make them more nervous to spend, particularly on more expensive activities, more and more people are saying that pursuing creative hobbies at home and in their own time is more and more important to them. That skews towards younger participants. It increased through the pandemic. So it's worth reflecting that not all culture is financially, not all of it has an economic impact, but even where people aren't spending on culture, that has a real impact on things like mental health, on well-being, on our sense of place, our connections across our communities. So it has wider societal impacts. Second thing is that many families with young children in particular are really keen to create memorable experiences for their children. Families don't want their kids to miss out, even where that means shifting their cultural spend so that their kids don't miss out even if they do. So where organisations have been able to shift and tailor cultural opportunities towards younger families, they've done really well. Things like shorter shows, different timings, things that are easily accessible or free or outdoors, on people's doorsteps, tends to do well and tends to attract a kind of an enthusiastic and a new audience. Outdoor heritage, people visiting their kind of things on their doorstep, did really well and were one of the first things to start to return after COVID. And likewise, attendance is shifting in general. So both older and younger audiences seem to be attending differently, particularly places like the theatre, more traditional cultural attendance. So places like the National Theatre in London have been experimenting with earlier show times, people getting home earlier, taking public transport home. And there's evidence that makes some people more likely to attend. Women, which might be related to the public transport thing, people with children, for obvious reasons, people who work from home and aren't necessarily following a traditional commuter, going out for drinks after work, onto the theatre kind of pattern, and those outside of London. It also means that shows that are known quantities, famous names, adaptations, tend to do quite well. People feel like it's less of a risk, that they can justify the expenditure on something that they know will be good. And it's not all bad news. People do and are spending on culture. So Taylor Swift and Oasis prove, I think, that people will spend in vast numbers on very expensive tickets for something that they know will be brilliant. And maybe at the other end of the scale, community-based creative opportunities, locally based participatory heritage stuff is really thriving. Things that bring people together across generations, that grandparents can bring grandchildren to, for example, and things that are deeply rooted to the issues that people care about in the rest of their lives, that connect to the challenges that they're facing, the questions that they have, the problems and opportunities that they're seeing in their place. And that invite people to participate in making their cultural experiences, not just come and see something, but come and be part of something. Culture is a way that we make sense of our worlds and relate to one another. So to wrap up, I think it feels like audiences are changing, but the world is changing too, and that's a challenge for organisations who for many years have been able to rely on a very loyal, very regular, very knowledgeable audience. That is changing, and that is a challenge for many places. Financial challenges will continue to be difficult for the sector, particularly in terms of getting people out and spending in bulk, but also in terms of creating sustainable and fair employment across the arts. It's a big employer, one that has for a long time struggled with creating sustainable employment and being able to support people from a range of backgrounds to work in the arts. But the audience patterns are changing, not just getting worse, and there is evidence that where organisations are shifting their provision to think about how they respond to that changing environment, people are participating. People don't give up on culture. They just do it differently and expect to experience it differently. So it feels like, as a sector, change will continue to be afoot, but there are some really exciting areas for the culture sector to respond to be part of, to continue to support people to explore their lives, to connect with one another, to connect with their places, and potentially, as we do so, to create a more responsive and more accessible cultural sector that is reflective of more of the population. I'll pause there. Thank you, Susan.
Thanks, Kathryn and Gary and Scott. Obviously, that was a whistle-stop tour of a ton of trends. I know the audience is always full of questions, so I won't dominate with the first question, which is what chairs usually do, but completely come to you to start us off. So who would like to ask the first question? Ooh, right. I'll bring the microphone to you, remember, for the things in the room. Johnny, you go first.
Thank you, Susan. Scott, Gary, Kathryn, thank you for your comments. I'm Johnny Timpson. I chair the Building Resilient Households Group. I also sit on the Financial Inclusion Commission and the Financial Services Consumer Panel. But in my Financial Inclusion Commission hat, we did some work last summer with CASM, the Centre for Household Assets and Savings Management at the University of Birmingham. And that was to inform the government's financial inclusion and resilience strategy. So the UK government. The UK government doesn't seem to like the word resilience anymore and is substituting well-being for it instead. But we did a number of assizes around the country. I chaired the one in Glasgow. And the one in Glasgow was quite a standout from Northern Ireland, Birmingham, Cardiff and London, because I was quite concerned. In Glasgow, we were seeing young people with children, this maybe Scott alludes to the fact that you're making, who were basically saying because of their level of indebtedness, they were actually taking physical steps to reduce their spending. But the spending they were reducing was opting out of their auto-enrolled pension schemes, which seems quite appropriate given we're in Standard Life's building today, or Phoenix Group's building. But the other thing that was even more concerning was that given the number of the audience that worked for local government and were in final salary schemes, they were opting out of those too. And it just strikes me, looking at the data that we got here, is that is there another way that we could cut this? Because maybe is the time come to build a score that reflects people's financial resilience to income and expenditure shocks, and start to track that and report on that? Because I think actually that might change the nature of some of the conversations that we're having. Strikes me that right now Scotland does have an issue with financial resilience to shock, be it income or expenditure. And we've got a lot of shock coming, baked into this coming and previous budget statements, with increased taxation for either direct and indirect, particularly indirect with council tax and other council charges that are being increased to make up for shortfall in local government spending. Sorry.
Do you want to say anything about the pension figure?
Back to my slide, because I can't remember if we have the households with children with the pensions on it on this. No, it's not there. But I can dig that out for you, and we can look at what people, because we've got the reducing pension payments, not paying into pension, and the kind of wider, findings. So we could have a look at that and see like how that's cut with households with children, because we've also got it by Scottish Parliament region as well. So it'd be interesting to actually see if Glasgow is an outlier in that, in the sort of overall between the 8 Scottish parliamentary regions. I think on the kind of wider point about modelling something on the kind of different, all the different aspects that you said. It's probably something worth thinking about. We can pick up a conversation around how we would actually do that for the analysis, because it strikes me that we probably have most of the data that you would need in order to do some kind of calculation of that.
Pre-COVID, I did some work with Baroness Drake with the, what was the Financial Inclusion Task Force. We worked with ONS at trying to build a financial inclusion score. We just got blown away by COVID at the time. ONS did run a test report, but it does strike me that, you know, we have a UK that is fixated with credit scores, and I think it's time actually to have a look at maybe we should be modelling resilience scores as they do in Scandinavia.
I mean, I think financial and housing resilience is really, really important, and there has been a series of shocks. I mean, a series of shocks over the last years, but we're still dealing with issues such as in-work poverty. Obviously, there's challenges around housing, challenges around costs, and I think to get to financial resilience of households, you're probably looking to move from income to kind of overall wealth and the distribution of wealth, because we know the kind of bottom 20-25% are really kind of, the picture's completely different. So wealth is linked to resilience, and I think some of the charts around who's concerned about money, it was about 16%. So the top end and bottom end are quite different, and there's people being squeezed in the middle.
The fact that France is now just voted to look at wealth tax for supervision, I think makes that conversation worth it.
Chris Carr, Edinburgh University Business School. A question really for Scott, which is very, very interesting data, I thought. Thank you very much. Just one question in terms of health policy. Arguably, one of the biggest successes for Scotland is preventative health with smoking and things. Are you able to kind of dip into that rather than just the general NHS, given that most of the diseases tend to be 10 years in the making these days? Then if we have time, just at the macro level, if you like, I mean, the other thing is, how far can your data be researched beyond the 3 years on issues like, you know, Europe, Scottish referendum, maybe comparative comparisons with England or Ireland particularly? So I'd be interested to know whether there's kind of research potential there.
Yeah, so in your first question, I think, so on that battery, we only have it as healthcare and the NHS. Now, that's not to say we've obviously got the impact on money matters question, which, you know, we have that kind of big list of values on it where we have the impact on, you know, mental health, impact just on physical health itself. But I suppose there's an open conversation there around, well, is there something you can put in there around, you know, some of those aspects that you say, that so you can therefore start to track that over 12 months? On the potential to compare to other things, now we can't go back further than when we started on this kind of stuff to 2021 here. However, some of those questions, like right and wrong direction, you know, there are similar sorts of questions asked on different surveys also, including the Edinburgh University's Scottish Public Opinion Monitor that the Scottish Election Study is going to be continuing to do. But yeah, the research potential to compare with Ireland and, you know, the rest of the UK is there. So I made a kind of passing statement to the issue prioritisation. So yeah, for example, similar questions are asked in UK-wide surveys about issue prioritisation compared to this, and that's how we can tell that, for example, while immigration will feature regularly in the top 5 issues in England, we know it doesn't regularly feature in the top 5 in Scotland. So the potential is there to do all sorts with it, basically, and I would be delighted to have a conversation with you about what you might want to get out of it and share the data with you.
Hello, I'm John Sturrock. Professionally, I'm a mediator, so I'm interested in differences. And one of the differences I noted on one of the slides, Scott, was that between your male and female respondents, where in the list of top priorities, economy did not appear in the top 5 for females. I'm just wrestling with what the implications of that might be, if any. I put that to you. And I'm wondering if there's any sense of maybe even some sort of unconscious bias at play, and in the whole way we approach this material, it's being viewed through a male prism. So that's, I mean, provocative in putting that to you, but I'm interested in what if any, implications, as I say, you take from that finding.
It's definitely an interesting point. If you look at the kind of economic priorities, we see it come to bear really there. So we find that, you know, male respondents are more likely to talk about, you know, measures like economic growth over sort of, you know, improving maybe living standards and wages. They maybe are more likely to see growth as a driver. And I think you're quite right to say a lot of politics talks around sort of driving economic growth as a driver to all those other things. It's similar when we look at the issue prioritisation, as you say. Women are more likely to see poverty and inequality as a sort of top issue versus men. I think it is interesting. The other thing, though, the aspect of that is how do you layer that down again then? So if you take that down another level and you start to put age into that, like, you know, do the effects perhaps cancel each other out, or, you know, things like that. But I think the point that you make is a really interesting one. There's a lot of, especially because you're a mediator, you'll be interested, there is lots of like conflict, like, you know, within sort of generational as well, within, you know, data like this that we see, like different priorities. And it really has become up to like going into like next year another election. Well, actually, how do political parties wrestle with that? Because they've got to make a pitch to a kind of wider spectrum, but actually, if environment and climate change is a much higher issue for kind of younger voters than it is for older, how do you wrestle with that? So, yeah, there's definitely stuff in there, and we've probably just picked out little bits of it for now, but yeah, we could do some stuff around trends on it as well, which might be interesting.
Can I ask on the difference point? Sorry, you're going to come in, but can you break down sub-Scotland? Because we did our sentiment data, we were able to kind of break down the regions, and there's different patterns from Glasgow to Highlands and Islands to Aberdeen South in terms of kind of outlook and optimism.
Yeah, we've got all 8 Scottish parliamentary regions on it, so we can break down everything by region as well.
On the gender question, which is a really interesting one, I'm reminded of just after Brexit, I watched a brilliant documentary called Brexitania, which interviewed people across the country about their views on Brexit. And we hosted a conversation with the filmmaker. And his experience was it was very difficult to get women to talk about Brexit, not because they had less knowledge, but because they had less confidence in expressing their views, kind of in that it's going to be on a film. So he spoke to many women who said, oh, you'll need to speak to my husband about that, or my whoever, and would pass him on. He would then speak to their husband or whoever, and they'd be talking absolute nonsense. They had no more knowledge. But it was a really interesting experience that he really kind of battled through, of saying, no, I really want to hear what you say. But his experience on that was lots of women, and particularly older women, I think, felt like I just don't have the confidence to say in public what I think. And I wonder if there's a reflection on that in the talking about the economy, about I'm just not, I don't feel confident enough in my experience or my opinions to respond to even to the survey in that way. And it would be fascinating to drill down, because it's potentially not at all reflective of difference of knowledge, but a difference in confidence in that knowledge, I think.
Excuse me. Hi, my name's Angie Chandler, and I'm a director with Crown Estate Scotland. But in a previous life, I used to also head the cultural and economic development portfolio for local government. So my question is really for Kathryn and Gary, but it kind of leads on from the data that you've presented there around concerns around healthcare, and really understanding from a social prescribing perspective. Have we quantified the impact of investment in the cultural sector with, preventative benefits from a healthcare perspective? So going back to your point around how do we quantify preventative investment, and so that there are better decisions at the upfront, at the outset, as opposed to us reacting to problems, understanding where the problems are. Mental health is a massive issue. So has anything been done, or is that something that should be looked at in a bit more detail, would be my question. Thank you.
Go for it and I'll follow up.
Okay, so I think, so in terms of work around preventative spend, the value of culture and stuff, there's definitely research and stuff there. I think social prescribing, really interesting model, and there's always been a desire to kind of move upstream and have more preventative spend. In the health context, it's interesting because obviously we see health as a major issue politically, but we see kind of demand for health really strong at the minute, kind of post-COVID. So the challenge with preventative is, in a sense, is how can you meet the demand but kind of shift the investment, and that's really the challenge. But probably linked to Kathryn's points, maybe around some of the benefits of cultural activities, if people are cutting back and spend, the extent to which that impacts young people, in particular, kind of mental health or resilience, and then comes back in demand. The best work I've seen in terms of preventative spend recently is Victoria State in Australia, where they've managed a shift in their model. They've got an early intervention framework, and they've managed a shift and basically to upstream preventative spend to about 10% of their budget. And this is the first budget this year where they've got flat cash for health. And that's because they're starting to realise savings now from kind of early investment. But it's a really, really difficult thing to do. It's a long-term thing, and it's hard to do it when you're in the midst of a kind of a demand crisis, if you put it that way.
And also I think the connections between preventative spend on health and how that impacts other parts of people's lives, it not always necessarily being we're spending this, here's the impact on health in a kind of one-to-one relationship. So prior to doing this job, I led Creative Scotland's Culture Collective programme, which was an investment in participatory arts projects across Scotland. So they were really kind of locally responsive and multifaceted projects, but often connected to things like people with a history of drug addiction, people with mental health crises, particularly actually around loneliness, isolation, those sorts of chronic mental health issues. And they weren't health-focused interventions, but very often, because they responded to what people cared about and what people's lives felt like, ended up having a health-based focus or a health-based impact. And it's really interesting because that doesn't land as preventative spend. That isn't a preventative health programme, but absolutely has preventative health impact. So I think we see really profound and convincing analysis and evaluation where there is a direct health implication on things like, for example, Scottish Ballet's Dance for Dementia programme, but where they're much more about a societal level, a community benefit, a whole person approach, I think that's much harder to measure, and I think that the analysis of that is more complicated. But Tejas is here, and I'm sure would love to input on that.
Hi, thanks, Kathryn. Excuse me, I'm Tejas from Voluntary Health Scotland, and really interested to hear. I think more colleagues across different stakeholder groups are interested in preventative spend and the economy and topics like social prescribing. And I guess just as part of that, Public Health Scotland and the Scottish Government are currently working at the moment around a new action plan linked to social prescribing as part of their population health framework. So I think we're likely to see significant developments in that area. Excuse me. My question was really related to Kathryn's perspective around heritage and inequalities that you talked about. I'm really interested to understand what's your perspective on looking ahead, really, because there's such an overlap between kind of the funding settlements that are happening, things like relatively positive for Creative Scotland, the outlook for the workforce within culture and the arts holistically, and the uncertainty that's sat there traditionally, I suppose, and then how that translates to those wider social groups, particularly thinking about inclusion and inequality, where we're seeing challenges for particularly third sector organisations at the moment. So just thinking, I suppose, that kind of microeconomy around culture, I was keen to get your views on how that's looking ahead.
Thank you. There's loads there, isn't there? The workforce thing is really fascinating and feels quite timely. So most people will know there was a positive investment in culture in the Scottish budget, and the knock-on effect of that was Creative Scotland announced multi-year funding decisions a few weeks ago, which will have very immediate and very significant benefits for the workforce in parts of the cultural sector, those parts that are directly funded by Creative Scotland. And we're seeing that almost immediately. It feels like there is a turning of the tide in people feeling confident to recruit, in feeling confident to plan for the longer term, for example, and also feeling more positive about the future, feeling like things will get better, particularly for a very freelance workforce where precarity often leads to people just looking outside the sector, finding work elsewhere. And we saw that in huge numbers during COVID, particularly for the parts of the workforce who don't have a financial safety net. So we saw growing inequality within the workforce. That feels more positive, literally as of the last 3 weeks. However, that is focused very much on the publicly funded part of the sector that benefit from Creative Scotland's multi-year funding decisions. Heritage is largely outside that. The connections with the third sector and the wider charity sector are broadly outside of that. And there are real resonances there where that positive impact isn't necessarily being felt in the same way. You talked earlier about national insurance contributions, which have been a huge concern for the charity sector in general and for many arts employers. And the knock-on effect for the social groups you mentioned. Heritage often is one of those things that feels more accessible to more parts of the population, often because there are lower barriers to entry in terms of, people walk their dogs around their local, country estate. They go to their local museums in a way that they might not go to the National Gallery on a weekend. It's not always the case, it's not the case for everybody, but going for a picnic in a local park is something that more parts of the population do than go to the theatre, for example. So heritage in particular feels like there is still that question of how do we start to see that more long-term thinking, that more optimism about the future that we're starting to see in the publicly funded arts sector. We need to see that knock on, I think, and be echoed in the heritage and the third sector. And I don't think we're there yet.
I've got 2 quick questions that we can squeeze in, if that's okay.
So, sorry, David Gale, I'm from the trustee at the DHI. Sorry, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, so mainly a question for Gary, because Gary, you talked about the, somewhat differences between the Scottish and a UK outlook, and notably you talked about offshore investment, infrastructure and so on. But are there things within the, as it were, the internal domestic economic toolkit which the Scottish government can use in order to boost consumer and business confidence, and not necessarily relying on the Department of Government Expenditure, which Anna Sarwar has presented before the Scottish electorate. Perhaps we should rename him Elon.
And final questions over here.
This is a question for the whole panel. So obviously on the report it showed that young Scots are kind of the most financially insecure. And there was a UK youth report published at the end of last year that talked about how young people feel undervalued, less effective, as you said in the report, Scott, and patronised at work just due to their age. Now, I know you said that young people are the most optimistic about the future, but it kind of feels like, the odds are kind of stacked against us. So you've got no choice but to look positively. So just for all of you, do you believe that there is like real positive means for young people to achieve financial stability, or are there structural barriers in Scotland that block that from happening?
Okay, I'll go first with maybe the kind of growth question and the internal toolkit. So there's loads the Scottish Government can do around devolved areas. Planning is one, so they're looking at the planning system, ensuring we've got enough planners, regulation. There's stuff around enterprise support, innovation, how we work with our universities to get the kind of knowledge base that's there kind of spun out into new businesses. There's an economic plan around National Strategy for Economic Transformation that kind of sets out a lot of those things we're doing. I mentioned offshore wind because of ScotWind and the different things that are happening there, but in Edinburgh you've got digital tech, you've got fintech, you've got life sciences throughout Scotland as well. Food and drink is a kind of still a mainstay of the economy. So there's loads of different stuff that's going on. Obviously Scottish Government as well, training, skills, all of that side. So there's loads in there within a broader external environment. And the external environment is important, even for offshore wind. It's a UK energy market. There's kind of global effects as well. So there's loads going on. Our Deputy First Minister, Kate Forbes, is kind of across all of the economy issues, in particular, has a role about coordinating investment across Scotland, whether it's housing, offshore wind, infrastructure, grid. So I think it's one of the 4 key priorities of the government. Essentially the growth alongside child poverty, net zero, and kind of making public services more resilient. So, but I'll pause there and let someone else. You can start with the young ones, do you?
Well, I was just going to mention the importance of fair work, I think, in responding to that question, and particularly for people wanting a career in the arts and creative industries. It's a sector that for a long time has been dependent on young people volunteering their time to get a foothold in the labour market. It's kind of ironic that working for free is the preserve of people who are relatively wealthy. And so I think fair work, particularly tackling things like unpaid internships, entry-level jobs, realistic progression, particularly in a sector that is very heavily reliant on the freelance workforce, who don't always get the financial protections of employment. Susan mentioned that I sit on the Culture and Fair Work Task Force that's due to publish this summer, and I think thinking about young people in the context of what a sustainable career looks like, what a realistic career looks like, and where it's responsible for us to encourage young people to go into a career that can be incredibly precarious and has in the past been exploitative of many young people's time and skills.
I mean, on the young people, I've got 2 sons myself that at university, and from their friendship groups and different friends, I kind of see quite a confident young outlook. I see loads of more kids going to university, doing different things. I see that investment in human capital, but it's a difficult transition, and I think we'll get the benefits of that transition as an economy, as more people are doing that. On the other side, the kind of modern apprenticeship route, skills route, different stuff there, but I think some of the challenges for young people are around the kind of wealth distribution, the difference between generations, and the bigger issues about housing and the trends that staying at home longer, and it's different. So that's a generational issue, I think, for young people, but I think the young people we've got are great. That's my bias. So there you are.
We're right up against time. Are you all right, Scott, if we finish on young people are great?
Yep.
I can see we've still got more questions. I'm so sorry, but I have to bring it in on time for the online audience. There will still be tea and coffee and lovely bacon rolls and pastries left, thanks to the Phoenix Group and Standard Life House speakers. So do stay if you want to carry on the conversation. I would just like to sum up on a few things, if that's okay. There's a tip for the young person that asked the question. I was scrolling LinkedIn. I'm fascinated by LinkedIn and stories that are there. And there's someone that we worked with on a previous Free Chat project called Elsa McFarlane. And she was part of a conversation where they were sharing their entry into the cultural sector and how they did it and what they did first. And that's a really interesting thread, if you can call it a thread on LinkedIn, I'm not sure. But that's there. Picking up on John Sturrock's point about gender, I think growth and the poverty and inequality are 2 sides of the same coin, and I think men and women are just using different language to talk about similar issues. So I wouldn't say at all that this has been analysed with a male point of view, because I am not male, if I'm allowed to say that in this gender discussion. I probably shouldn't even go there, should I? But I think it's really important, but I think we shouldn't get away from the fact that we still have many households where women are doing the majority of the shopping and the majority of the caring for children, and will know the costs of every child's activity, and that it's really, really expensive to be a parent, and we see that in the numbers, and that does pull out really well. I can see Alan telling me I'm over time by a minute, so I will stop talking, but the value of tracking these trends over time is really important, but it also gives all of you the chance to see these trends and know what is happening as it happens. And that's why we bust a gut to turn this around in a few weeks each time, so you get the data when it's fresh and still really, really useful. So whatever job you have, whatever role in life you have, please do think about this data and how it affects those around you, because we are all in a position to do something about this data, no matter how big or small that is. So thank you very much for being part of the conversation today. We hope to see you again at the next one, which will be round about, I think it's the 26th of May, which is a Tuesday next time, because the Monday is a bank holiday. So please do join us again, and let's say thank you to our panel in the usual way.